actor network theory. What did you think of that?
So I think I was just gonna say, like, it just reminds me of, like, I feel like there's this theory going on right now that it pops up in lots of different ways in lots of different places, and that just reminded me of, like, I don't think it's directly connected, but it just feels, it has the same feeling of, for example, like James Bridle talks a lot about how who designs the technology impacts how the technology affects us, and so the democratization of the invention of technology is important to establishing like a equality in technology, so to speak. Like, it's important that it's not just, for example, the white dudes controlling Facebook, because then Facebook will be a white platform essentially, and so forth, like as a microcosm.
I think that's interesting, especially thinking about the way our spaces are designed, and how only kind of recently it's come about that maybe we should be thinking about it from like a sociological perspective. And like, before it seemed like it was just, this is the science of logic, so, but it's not the science of logic, it's the science of like that man.
I mean, yeah, like that just reminds me of there was a podcast that I'm not going to remember the author of, but Spaces That Make You Believe, and he was talking about the design of courts and how that kind of design institutes a certain idea of justice, and how that makes you believe it. And I think you could say a very similar thing about white cube art gallery spaces, like lending a certain authority on the,
like that certain authenticity of like, now this is art kind of thing, now that it's on this
and
mode
the
that
context.
we're used to seeing it kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that can sometimes alienate some people as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Make it harder to kind of access that kind of thinking when it's like only in these certain spaces.
Yeah, I think hey, ideally the white cube would be one of many spaces that exist, and it's not that the white cube in itself is problematic. The problematic arises when it monopolizes our understanding of art, and that's like art only exists within a white cube, and that's the only and it doesn't achieve that authority or that hierarchy until it is in the white cube space, and like that's how we define art.
Interesting looking at your work at King's Gallery. When was that?
So that was in February, and that was the second iteration of 2019, and that was the second iteration. The
so
work had also been shown in November at the grad show at Monash.
Right.
Yeah.
Was that somehow different from that grad show? Just kind of kept going?
Yeah, the big difference was that the grad show was this massive hall, and the space was so conducive to a particular way of arranging that work, and then when it came back into the rectangle, it was actually a pretty big relief because it was a much easier install. Yeah.
Do you think that that space having like a long hall is good when you're thinking about historical events that can sometimes be linear or challenge that kind of?
It was a very it had more spatiality to it, and I had to work a lot harder to make sure that, because the feeling I'm going for is like overwhelming and
I get that.
saturated, and so when it's stretched out along a line, that really challenged me.
I got that sense or that feeling from seeing all that paper. It gave me anxiety, like looking at it, and I could kind of like understand the way that you're working through this. To what degree does play, in the sense of like using your materials in a playful way, impact, or is that something you use in your practice, or is that an afterthought? To what degree does that?
Yeah. I think that maybe not exactly play, but kind of coming at the work from different levels of, like, sometimes it's really important to be serious and in a mode of making art, and sometimes it's important to approach it when you're distracted, and sometimes it's important to approach it when you feel silly, and like to come at it with all your different emotions, and in that sense coming at it joyously and playfully in a space where you're not afraid to make mistakes, I think is important. But then kind of like, I find it's a constant process of being silly and ridiculous, and then editing back and being stern and firm, and that kind of back and forth, creating a momentum.
So like self-editing is quite a big part of your work.
Absolutely.
Coming back, or kind of doing that as you're working through, do you think?
I mean, a bit of both, admittedly, but I think that especially as I come to an end, it's important for me to look at the narratives that I'm trying to communicate, and then kind of attack what distracts from those narratives, or what makes it hard for my audience to engage, or what might be there for me more than it is for the audience.
Is that the degree that which your audience is involved and understands your message? Is that something at the heart of your work, or is that something an afterthought as well?
I think it has to be a consideration, and I think also I think I am my audience, so to speak, and I am my community, and so this idea of working outside of my community seems kind of artificial and very individualistic.
It's interesting that you said that sometimes we view this binary kind of like us and them, because you talk about using, like, I think I read in one of your essays, like using your sense of childhood identity to kind of understand or look at these like an event like 9/11, but also it's interesting when we say like that was my child self. Do you think that is actually other from yourself now?
No. I mean, it's still very much there, and I guess engaging with something like 9/11 or with like a very heavy event, I think it's too easy to let the adults in the room lead the discussion, when like you do experience that as a child, and you do actually, like, I remember looking at all the nuclear stockpiles in the world and figuring out what mutually assured destruction was at about 12, and kind of like thinking about that as a child. And I don't think it's beyond a child's mind to contemplate quite grim things, and yet like without just kind of turning it into like a huge fear game. I think that that does imprint us, and that I guess my sense is that we should allow ourselves to be vulnerable in those spaces if we can, and to experience those with a bit more humanity than just kind of this hard bureaucratic
this sense of this is the logical way to proceed from now, but it's like there is no logical way, because it's, you know, catastrophic, you know, in almost some words.
A word like absurdity comes to mind, like kind of sitting with the ridiculousness of a situation like that.
Do you think that's something like using your child self, or even just that as a framework, that idea is something you're going to continue, or is that like in your work? Do you think it's a helpful tool to make content, or?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that children think quite laterally around things, and they kind of they stumble through our manners and our technique and our discipline, and they say, well, why is this wall here? Like, what's it doing? There's no reason for this. And I think in prodding our kind of, like, as you're saying, logic, or this like internalized bias of normalizing what is a very absurd situation, they offer us, and we, our inner children, offer us kind of, I guess, like a sort of salvation from our kind of rigidity.
I think that loss of ego can also be helpful when we're talking about like what type of audiences are we engaging with, and like how is this content being used, and what is the end kind of goal for this, like, because I'm always thinking like I'm doing something and I'm writing about these things, but like what's going to happen with that knowledge? What's going to, like, is that going to change me as a person? Is that going to I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. It's important to have a certain pragmatism. I just think as you're saying all of that, like, I'm totally on board with that. The flip side of that is that you don't know where you're going until you've got there, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that kind of like with sciences, for instance, there's actually quite a good reason for just kind of learning for the sake of learning, and I think the word is heuristic purposes, just kind of gaining insight regardless of what comes of that, because like just knowing the territory and knowing the exploring it effectively will lead to new developments. Yeah.
Well, I think that kind of comes back to that child. I always keep coming back to it, but just following what you're interested in, and just like something pricks your fancy.
Yeah.
That's what I'm going to delve into, and not being not second guessing that because you don't know that already.
Yeah. I mean, I think intuition is a bizarre, you know, like really speaking with your subconscious. It sounds almost corny, but it leads to very wild things. And I think as a thinker, it's not always about the most critical thoughts, but also about your intuition guiding you where you need to go, and being able to trust that. In a sense.
I think it's hard to sometimes come to terms with like following your intuition, and also like having some sense of framework as well.
So getting back to Bullet Hell, the show that I had at King's, that whole thing started with kind of a joke in my head of having a really big image of a nail being pulled off, like nail gore, and then a tiny image of the 9/11 trade towers coming down. And it all kind of came from there, of this, I guess, distorted sense of like this distorted perspective we get online, where, you know, you have like 10 puppy photos on Facebook, and then like amidst all of that, like, oh, there's been a revolution in Sudan, and it's like it's quite but that, for me, approaching that in a playful way, and approaching that as someone who, you know, is browsing Facebook sleepy, and is you know, on the toilet, and is a human being in a body who's like crude and laughing and you know, like kind of shit, is important, as like, because that's the truth of it. Like, we're not all approaching it as researchers and academics,
and that nothing is objective. Like, we don't come to read these articles from a purely like nothingness, which is I think sometimes it's forgotten. Sometimes it's like everyone has histories, everyone has, you know, something that they're doing.
I mean, humour, like, and kind
do you think that there's a lot of work that's like lacking humour these days?
I
Do you
think
think that it takes like some work, I don't know, too serious sometimes?
I think in art, as it's traditionally understood, visual arts, I think there is a fair bit of humour, but I think maybe what I'm talking about more is when we're talking about historical events, for instance. I don't think there's a lot of humour, and I think that humour in that context is actually really needed to come to a more human understanding.
It's interesting that like we really put like, to show humour sometimes is really like shameful, or like there's only a certain type of response that's really accepted.
I mean, when I was doing genocide studies, there's a lot of things that make me laugh. Like, for example, really flagrant displays of power often make me laugh, because I don't know what else to do with that. Like, I find it
and
funny.
As an individual, like,
how
do I kind of rectify or like understand this when I'm only me?
And I mean, yeah, I think equally that there are points where I cry and where lots of other emotions are available as well.
Yeah.
It's just that I don't think there's any taboo there. I don't think there's any space that shouldn't, let's bring our whole selves to the picture and really honestly explore an event like that. Or, yeah.
Just going back to the start,
Yep.
we both watched the Actor Network Theory YouTube. I was actually just thinking about the when he talks about like materials having their own life and their own sense of meaning. Can you speak to that with your work with paper in your? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like I'm trying to think about it, but I'm also like thinking around it.
Yeah, I'm gonna relate to Actor Network Theory a bit crudely because I don't have a lot of research in it. But what I can say is that in terms of paper, I've had many different relationships with paper, and I've had a very deep relationship with it, where whether it's meditatively folding origami, which I've done since 12, or
I saw the things that you
yeah,
I loved that.
like keeping sketchbooks or diaries, or printing essays, or receiving pamphlets or newspapers. I feel like all of that experience of paper came up in that work. And I also think that sorry to interrupt, but I think it really started to feel for me like I have these archives, these big boxes of papers where effectively like I exist in there, and there's something very there's something very
it's very also of that time of what you're talking about 9/11. It's like the newspaper, and like it's very of that.
Some of the images I included in there are a bit abstracted, but are images of papers being let out of the building.
Yeah, those images.
Yeah, and I find it amazing because if a plane hit a tower these days, there's a fair chance that that image of all these papers scanning out wouldn't happen because offices are digital now. So it's this
that's so true.
moment where like so many things happened in 9/11. Like I think a lot of people look at it now as potentially the end of the American empire, but I also kind of feel like it was a moment where paper was leaving because Al-Qaeda was one of the first terrorist organizations organized via online. So previous terrorist organizations would have relied on paper in a way that Al-Qaeda didn't. And it is kind of funny. Like I only picked up on that quite deep into the work, actually realizing how my own connection with paper, because as I said before, in National Geographic magazine, you know,
exactly. You have these memories, and often they come from paper or from looking for
it's quite like there's lots of tones to that work that I didn't actually realize I was doing until like even February when I was reinstalling. I was like,
intuition at play as well. Sometimes we've already thought about it or around it, and it only takes us like actually doing it, then we kind of make these connections.
I mean, I don't think anyone could ever quite know what they're doing, you know, like we're all kind of sleepwalking through, in the sense that the meaning will be constantly redefined according to who is looking at it and what time it is being observed within. Like if that work manages to survive in people's memories another 20 years, it's going to be an entirely different work, you know?